He arrived at the music hall early in the morning, the first rays of sun cutting through the streets like thin threads of gold. The hall loomed ahead, tall and imposing, with banners announcing a special audition that would feature some of the most talented musicians in the region. People were already gathering outside, dressed in smart coats and shiny shoes, their conversations a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Everyone seemed to know someone, or at least wanted to look like they belonged. He was different. His coat was worn and patched in several places. The shoes he wore were scuffed and had seen better days. The scarf around his neck had a small tear, barely stitched back together. Even his hat, pulled low over his forehead, looked like it had spent years shielding him from wind and rain. He moved carefully through the crowd, keeping his head down, aware of the glances and whispers. People noticed him immediately, and not in a good way. They judged him, as people often do, without knowing anything about him. His appearance told a story of poverty, struggle, and perhaps failure. They didn't see a man with a fire inside, a mind full of music waiting to escape. Inside the hall, the air was filled with the smell of polished wood and the faint hint of dust. The walls were lined with portraits of celebrated musicians, each one staring down with an air of approval or disdain, as if silently measuring the newcomers. The floor creaked slightly under the weight of footsteps, a reminder of the countless performers who had walked these boards before. He stepped carefully, taking in the grand piano at the center of the stage. It gleamed under the light, every curve and corner speaking of craftsmanship and history. He had never performed in such a place before, yet there was no fear in him, only a quiet anticipation. The room was filling quickly with people. Critics taking notes on small notepads, wealthy patrons whispering to each other, students trying to memorize every detail. He could feel their eyes on him as he moved toward the registration desk, where a young woman with bright eyes looked up and smiled politely. She glanced at his papers, then down at his coat, then back at him. There was a flicker of hesitation in her smile, but she didn't say anything. He gave a small nod of thanks and took his place in line. Around him, the chatter continued. People whispered about who was likely to win, who had trained where, and who had performed in famous halls before. No one mentioned him. Sitting in the waiting area, he took a deep breath and closed his eyes for a moment. He could hear the sound of other musicians practicing nearby, scales and arpeggios drifting through the air like faint whispers. Some of the notes were sharp and awkward, others smooth and confident. He could feel the tension in the room, the invisible pressure of expectation and comparison. He reminded himself that appearances often fooled people, that talent could be hidden behind the most unassuming forms. This was his moment, and he would not let it be defined by the coat on his back or the shoes on his feet. Time moved slowly, as it does when anticipation is thick in the air. One by one, performers were called to the stage. Some were greeted with applause, their polished appearance matching their confident performances. Others faltered despite looking the part. He watched from the sidelines, taking mental notes, not of the music itself but of the reactions of the audience. People clapped politely for those who seemed to deserve it, but their eyes often searched for someone they expected to impress them. He could see the subtle shifting in the seats, the murmurs that passed between neighbors, all trying to guess who would truly shine. Finally, his name was called. It sounded strange even to his own ears, as though it belonged to someone else entirely. He stood slowly, adjusting the scarf around his neck and brushing an invisible layer of dust from his coat. The walk to the stage felt long, each step echoing in the silent anticipation. When he reached the piano, he stopped for a moment, running his fingers lightly over the keys. They were cool under his touch, smooth and familiar, as if they had been waiting for him all along. The audience leaned forward slightly, curiosity mixed with judgment. Some were already forming opinions. A man in the front row shook his head subtly, a woman whispered to her companion, and a few young students scribbled in their notebooks, noting the contrast between his appearance and the grandeur of the hall. He ignored them. He never played for approval, never played for anyone's expectations. The music was in him, a current of emotion and thought that could not be contained. He began softly, almost hesitantly, letting the first notes drift into the air. There was a delicate precision in his touch, a subtle control that immediately suggested a deep understanding of the instrument. At first, the audience was uncertain, their eyes searching for mistakes that were not there. The notes were simple, almost shy, but they carried an undercurrent of something more powerful, something that began to draw attention despite themselves. A few heads tilted, a few people stopped whispering. They were listening now, really listening, and the initial judgments they had made began to falter. With each passing moment, his confidence grew. The music swelled gently, filling the hall with layers of sound that were both intricate and harmonious. He moved seamlessly between passages that demanded technical skill and moments that required deep emotional resonance. It was not loud or showy. It was precise and heartfelt. The audience could not deny it, though some tried to cling to their first impressions. The man in the front row who had shaken his head earlier now sat frozen, the pencil in his hand forgotten. The woman who had whispered turned slightly, as if to make sure she was not imagining what she was hearing. He played as if he were telling a story, each phrase a sentence, each chord a chapter. The music spoke of struggle, of quiet moments of joy, of deep longing and hope. The audience was captivated, though many refused to show it immediately. Some tried to focus on the coat, the shoes, the hat, anything that reminded them to hold on to their assumptions. But the sound was too strong, too true. It carried a weight that no outward appearance could diminish. Minutes passed, but in those moments, the world outside seemed to vanish. The whispers stopped, the shuffling of papers ceased, and even the ticking of the clock in the back of the hall seemed to synchronize with the rhythm of his playing. He was alone with the piano, and yet the hall was full, every listener caught in the invisible threads of his music. He felt a strange calm, a sense of purpose that had always been with him, but had never felt so immediate and vital. When the final note lingered and slowly faded, there was a silence so profound it almost hurt. The audience had no idea what to do at first. They had expected a timid performance, a man overshadowed by appearances. Instead, they had witnessed something extraordinary. Slowly, applause began, hesitant at first, then growing louder, filling the hall with a wave of recognition. Some stood, others clapped vigorously, and a few wiped their eyes, moved by the unexpected beauty they had just experienced. He rose from the bench quietly, letting the applause wash over him without seeking it. He knew the music had spoken for itself, and that was enough. As he stepped back from the piano, there was a sense of acknowledgement, not just for the skill he had displayed, but for the person he was beyond appearances. He did not smile widely, he did not bow theatrically. He simply nodded slightly and moved off the stage, leaving behind an audience that had been forced to rethink their assumptions. In that moment, the truth became clear. Talent cannot be judged by the clothes someone wears, the shoes they walk in, or the scarf wrapped around their neck. True skill, true genius, shows itself when the time comes, and it demands attention regardless of appearances. The hall would remember this performance, not because of the man's coat or hat, but because of the music that came from a heart that refused to be overlooked. Outside, the day continued, but inside the music hall, something had changed. The whispers now carried respect instead of doubt. People looked at each other with a new understanding that first impressions are fragile and often wrong. He walked into the morning light, his worn shoes touching the pavement, carrying with him the quiet satisfaction of someone who had proven that the measure of a person is never in the clothes they wear, but in the depth of what they can create and share. He sat back down at the piano for the second round, the quiet murmur of the audience surrounding him. His hands hovered for a moment above the keys, and the hall seemed to hold its breath. The audience, still amazed by the first performance, had shifted from polite curiosity to intense expectation. Some people were still unsure, hesitant to let go of their previous judgments, while others leaned forward, eager to hear more. He ignored them all, focusing solely on the music within him. The first notes were soft, almost delicate, like a gentle breeze brushing over the trees. He moved slowly at first, letting the sound fill the air with a sense of calm. Those who had doubted him began to pause, unsure if they had expected such refinement. Even the critics in the front row leaned slightly closer, pencils poised, not to critique this time, but to catch every detail of what was unfolding. The complexity of the music was subtle at first, hiding its depth beneath flowing melodies. He built the music gradually, allowing small motifs to grow into richer phrases. Each hand moved independently, yet the two merged seamlessly, creating a texture that felt effortless. It was not just skill. It was understanding, a grasp of harmony and emotion that went far beyond technicality. The audience was now completely absorbed. The whispers and shifting of seats had vanished. Only the music existed, wrapping around each listener, drawing them into a story they could feel but not see. The hall seemed to transform as he played. The light from the windows glinted off the polished surfaces, reflecting tiny patterns that danced along with the music. Every chord he struck carried an emotion, a message of joy, sadness, hope, and longing. He had not rehearsed for their reactions, nor had he prepared to impress anyone. He played because it was a part of him, a language he spoke naturally. And now, for the first time in this hall, he was speaking to people who could understand, even if they had doubted him moments ago. A few notes brought gasps from the audience, delicate runs that twisted unexpectedly, yet landed perfectly in harmony. The ones who had judged him by his worn coat or patched shoes now struggled to reconcile the music with the image they had formed. How could someone so ordinary-looking create something so extraordinary? It was a question that many asked themselves silently, unable to voice it without betraying their earlier prejudice. As the performance continued, he added layers of expression, touching the lower keys with deep resonance, while letting the higher notes sparkle like sunlight on water. His hands danced across the keyboard with a confidence that seemed effortless, yet every movement was precise, intentional, and full of feeling. The music told a story, of a journey through struggle, of quiet moments of triumph, of beauty hidden in unlikely places. Those listening could feel it in their hearts, even if their minds had tried to hold onto skepticism. In the middle of the piece, he paused briefly, just a breath, to let the silence speak. It was a bold move, leaving the hall suspended in anticipation. The absence of sound was almost louder than the music itself. Then he returned to the keys with renewed energy, each note rising like a wave, cresting and falling in perfect rhythm. It was a display of mastery, but also of humanity. The audience no longer saw a man with humble clothes. They saw someone who could pour his soul into every note, who could make invisible feelings tangible. The younger students in the hall were wide-eyed, leaning forward to catch every detail. Many of them scribbled furiously in their notebooks, trying to remember not just the music, but the way it felt. Some of them had been taught to judge a musician by appearances, but now those lessons seemed irrelevant. Here was someone who defied all expectations, proving that the heart and mind mattered far more than outward looks. Even the seasoned critics, who had intended to dissect every performance, found themselves listening with awe rather than judgment. Their pens hovered over the paper, then fell as they became immersed in the flow of the music. One by one, their frowns melted into expressions of wonder. They recognized the genius of the performance not through flashy movements or showy gestures, but through the purity of expression and technical skill. He had captured something rare, something they had rarely encountered in their careers. The man played on, allowing the music to evolve naturally. He shifted from gentle melodies to more intense sections, each chord ringing with clarity and purpose. He did not rush, nor did he hesitate. Each moment was deliberate. It was as if the piano itself were an extension of his body, each note a reflection of his thoughts and emotions. The audience began to sway unconsciously, caught in the rhythm and flow, moving as though the music had taken control of them. There was a part of the piece that required extreme technical skill. A rapid series of runs, arpeggios, and complex patterns that tested even the most experienced pianists. He executed them flawlessly, yet without a hint of arrogance. The difficulty was hidden beneath the music, presented as something natural, beautiful, and inevitable. The audience recognized the mastery, feeling both admiration and awe. They were no longer simply listening. They were experiencing something profound, a connection between artist and listener that transcended words. As he approached the finale, he slowed the pace, allowing each note to resonate fully. There was a quiet strength in the final passages, a sense of resolution and peace. The music lingered, delicate and strong at the same time, leaving echoes in the hall that seemed to hang in the air. When he pressed the final key, it was with a gentle touch, letting it fade naturally into silence. The effect was astonishing, as though the hall itself were holding its breath for just a moment longer. The silence lasted only a heartbeat before the audience erupted into applause. It started quietly, from a few stunned listeners, then grew rapidly, filling every corner of the hall. People were on their feet, clapping, cheering, and some even wiping tears from their eyes. The man rose slowly, accepting the recognition without showiness or self-congratulation. His eyes were calm, almost serene, reflecting the satisfaction of someone who had shared a part of himself that few could see and had been understood. In the crowd, people whispered in disbelief, marveling at the transformation. They had assessed him by his clothes, his humble appearance, and found themselves completely wrong. The man who had walked in quietly, unnoticed and underestimated, had revealed a depth of talent that could not be denied. It was a lesson that lingered in the air. Appearances can deceive, and true greatness often comes from unexpected places. As he stepped away from the piano, he felt a quiet pride, not for the applause, but for the act of expression itself. Music had been his companion through long nights, through struggles and loneliness, and now it had spoken for him in a place that mattered. He walked back through the hall, acknowledging nods and smiles, but never lingering for praise. The moment had been shared, and that was enough. Outside the hall, the day was bright, yet nothing outside seemed more real than the music that had just filled the space. People continued their lives, but those who had been in the audience carried a memory that would not fade quickly. Some would remember the technical brilliance, others the emotion, but all would remember the man who defied expectations, who reminded them that talent and passion could not be measured by what someone wore. The story he told through the piano had spoken louder than words, and it would echo in their minds for a long time. As he walked home, the sounds of the city seemed softer, quieter, almost respectful. He thought of the next time he would play, the next opportunity to share the music that had always lived inside him. Nothing about his appearance had changed, and yet everything about the world's perception of him had shifted. The lesson was clear. True artistry cannot be hidden by worn coats, patched shoes, or any outward sign of humility. It resides in the heart and in the hands that bring it to life. He returned to the piano for the third part of his performance, the anticipation in the hall now palpable. The audience was no longer merely curious or skeptical. They were attentive, almost reverent. They had seen something unusual in the first two parts, a depth of talent they had not expected. Some still whispered to each other, trying to make sense of the contradiction between the man's humble appearance and the extraordinary music he created. Others had stopped whispering, simply leaning forward, letting the sound wash over them. He began gently, letting a slow, melodic line fill the air. It was simple at first, almost like a lullaby, but it carried an undercurrent of something more profound. His hands moved effortlessly, expressing emotion through subtle dynamics, small pauses, and delicate phrasing. The audience could feel the story behind the music, though no words were spoken. They leaned in unconsciously, caught in the delicate tension he created. As the melody developed, he introduced more complex harmonies. The music began to rise and fall like waves, swelling with emotion and retreating into quiet reflection. Each chord was carefully chosen, not just for technical effect, but to express a feeling that words could not capture. The people in the hall were captivated, noticing how the music seemed to speak directly to each listener. Some closed their eyes, letting themselves be fully immersed. Others held their breath, afraid to break the spell. The subtlety of his performance only made the louder passages more striking. When he moved to a faster section with cascading runs and intricate patterns, the audience could hardly believe the skill on display. His fingers flew across the keys with precision, yet every note had life and intention. It was technical mastery without arrogance, an art form elevated by humility. The contrast between his modest appearance and this astonishing talent made the experience even more intense for the audience. They realized they had misjudged him, and the realization made the music feel even more powerful. He was not content to simply show skill. He wanted to tell a story. Each sequence of notes was carefully woven to convey different emotions. There were passages that spoke of struggle, of nights spent practicing alone in quiet rooms, of longing and hope. Others conveyed joy and triumph, fleeting moments of light breaking through darkness. The audience felt each emotion as though it were their own, transported into a world created entirely by the music and the hands that played it. Even the critics, trained to evaluate with cold precision, found themselves captivated. Some had come expecting to find faults, to note every imperfection, but there were none. The performance was flawless, yet more than that, it was alive. It resonated on a level that could not be captured by scores or written reviews. One could see the change in the expressions of the judges. Their professional masks had melted away, replaced by genuine wonder. He moved seamlessly from one musical idea to another, linking them with subtle transitions that made the entire performance feel like a continuous journey. There were moments of tension, where the music teetered on the edge of dissonance, and moments of release, where the notes resolved into harmony. The audience could feel every shift, every twist of emotion. They no longer saw the man as a figure in worn clothes. They saw a storyteller, a creator whose language was sound itself. At one point he paused briefly, letting silence fall over the hall. The effect was electric. In that silence, the audience felt anticipation and reflection at the same time. Then he resumed, more quietly at first, then building gradually. Each note seemed to echo in the room, drawing the listeners deeper into the world he created. People who had been skeptical moments before now watched with open mouths, entirely absorbed. He reached a section that was emotionally intense, with powerful chords that required both strength and subtlety. His expression was calm, yet there was a fire in his eyes, a deep focus that revealed the connection between his mind, his heart, and his hands. The audience was swept along, feeling both the intensity and the delicacy of his playing. Some could not help but lean forward, feeling as though they were part of the story. Others closed their eyes, letting themselves be carried by the music, allowing it to stir feelings long buried. He introduced a variation that was both technically complex and emotionally charged. Fast passages intertwined with slow, lyrical lines, creating a texture that was both intricate and moving. Each phrase was crafted with care, each pause deliberate, allowing the audience to fully absorb the meaning behind the notes. It was clear that he was not playing to impress, but to communicate, to share something essential about life and emotion. The hall was silent save for the music. Even the sounds of shifting chairs or quiet coughs were swallowed by the power of the performance. People felt the intensity building, the music drawing them into its orbit. Those who had whispered or judged earlier now felt a sense of humility, realizing that they had been wrong to assess someone based solely on appearance. The performance was a lesson as much as it was an art, showing the audience that true talent often hides in unexpected places. As he approached the finale, the music became even more expressive, reaching heights of beauty and emotion that left the listeners breathless. The notes resonated, vibrating through the floor, the walls, and even the hearts of those in the audience. Each chord, each run, each pause was deliberate, forming a tapestry of sound that seemed larger than the room itself. The audience could feel the culmination of his journey, the depth of his skill, and the sincerity of his expression. The final moments were quiet yet powerful, a soft resolution that allowed the music to linger in the air. He pressed the last note gently, letting it fade naturally. The silence that followed was profound, as though the hall itself were holding its breath, reluctant to let go of the magic that had filled it. For a brief moment, time seemed suspended, and everyone was aware of the enormity of what they had witnessed. Then the applause began. It started quietly, a ripple that grew into a wave of sound, filling every corner of the hall. People rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, and some even weeping softly, overwhelmed by the beauty and depth of the performance. The man stood and bowed, but not extravagantly. His eyes were calm, his smile modest, reflecting the quiet satisfaction of someone who had shared something truly personal and had been understood. He had not sought validation, yet the recognition was undeniable. The whispers in the hall were no longer of doubt or judgment, but of admiration and wonder. People discussed the intricacies of his playing, the emotional weight of each passage, and the extraordinary talent they had just experienced. Those who had judged him by his clothes now realized how wrong they had been. He had not only performed brilliantly but had also taught a lesson in humility and perception. Talent, they now understood, cannot be measured by outward appearances. As he stepped away from the piano, he felt a quiet joy, not for the applause, but for the act of sharing music that had lived within him for so long. He walked slowly through the hall, acknowledging nods and smiles, but never lingering for praise. His purpose had been fulfilled, and the connection he had created with the audience was something he carried with him beyond the stage. Outside, the air was crisp, and the city carried on as it always had, but inside the minds and hearts of the audience, something had shifted. They had seen that true artistry could not be judged by clothes or appearance, and that sometimes the most extraordinary gifts come from the most unassuming places. The man disappeared into the streets, his presence understated, but his impact profound. The music had spoken, and it would echo long after the applause had faded. After the performance, the audience could hardly settle down. Conversations were buzzing everywhere, but not in the usual way. People weren't discussing who might have performed better or worse. They were discussing the man who had just taken the stage. Whispers of admiration, astonishment, and disbelief mingled together, creating a wave of energy that seemed to fill the entire hall. Many couldn't stop looking around, checking the expressions of others to make sure they weren't alone in their amazement. The man, meanwhile, sat quietly to the side, observing the reactions without a hint of pride. He understood the value of silence, of letting the music speak instead of his words. A few people approached him cautiously, unsure if they should disturb him. A wealthy patron, who had initially doubted him, now looked almost apologetic as he stepped forward and said something about the incredible skill and emotion he had witnessed. The man smiled faintly, nodding in acknowledgement, but did not dwell on the praise. Critics approached, notebooks in hand, their pens ready to capture every detail of what they had just heard. Yet even they seemed momentarily disarmed, searching for words that could do justice to the performance. Some fumbled through sentences, admitting that what they had seen was beyond expectation. A few scribbled hurriedly, not wanting to miss any note or nuance, but their eyes betrayed awe that couldn't be captured on paper. They were beginning to understand that judging by appearance alone had been a mistake. Students who had been quietly observing took tentative steps forward. Many of them approached, asking questions about the techniques he had used, the choices he had made, and the way he made music feel alive. He answered softly, explaining some elements without giving away too much, always encouraging curiosity. His humility and willingness to share inspired them more than his skill alone. They realized that true artistry wasn't about looking impressive or seeking attention. It was about dedication, practice, and the desire to communicate something meaningful. The man was aware of the changes in perception happening around him. People who had judged him by his worn coat or scuffed shoes were now reassessing everything they had assumed. Some appeared embarrassed, shifting their gaze or muttering apologies to themselves. Others looked contemplative, realizing that their assumptions had been shallow and unfair. It was not an easy lesson to learn, but it was one they would carry with them long after leaving the hall. He did not linger for long. There was no need to bask in admiration or chase recognition. The music had done its work, and the lesson was clear. Instead, he moved quietly, nodding politely to those who approached and answering questions with gentle clarity. Each interaction was brief but meaningful, leaving a lasting impression on those he spoke to. They felt they had encountered someone who was not just a musician but a teacher, a guide, and an example of perseverance and humility. As the day went on, the hall slowly emptied, But the conversations about the performance did not fade. People continued to talk, sharing their astonishment and discussing the depth of feeling in every note. Even those who had initially doubted him found themselves repeating his name, acknowledging the genius that had emerged from unexpected places. The impact of his performance reached far beyond the notes he had played. It was a reminder of the dangers of judging too quickly and the rewards of paying attention to what truly matters. He walked out into the afternoon light, the air fresh and filled with ordinary city sounds that contrasted with the extraordinary experience he had just created. He carried no luggage, no fanfare, no sense of needing to prove himself further. His reward had been in sharing his music and seeing its effect on the people who had underestimated him. The world outside would continue in its usual rhythm, but inside the minds of those who had witnessed him, a spark had been ignited. People on the street who caught sight of him might have judged him at first glance. The same coat, the same patched scarf, the same scuffed shoes, all could suggest poverty or insignificance. Yet those who had been in the hall saw him differently. They recognized the quiet strength, the dedication, and the ability to touch hearts. The man's presence had shifted from overlooked to unforgettable, a transformation that required no words, only music and authenticity. Back in the hall, some of the organizers and judges gathered to reflect on what had occurred. They admitted openly that their assumptions had been completely wrong. The man who had seemed unremarkable at first glance had delivered a performance that would be remembered for years. The humility with which he accepted praise only added to their admiration. Discussions turned from technical evaluations to personal reflections on bias, assumptions, and the importance of looking beyond appearances. He did not rush to fame or recognition. The applause and accolades, though significant, were not the goal. What mattered most was the way the music had bridged the gap between him and the audience, dissolving judgments and opening hearts. For the man, each note was a message, a way to connect with others on a level that was far deeper than clothing, wealth, or social status. The students who had approached him lingered the longest, eager to learn and absorb every bit of insight they could. They asked about practice routines, how he had developed his sense of timing, and how he translated emotion into music. His responses were simple yet profound, emphasizing patience, observation, and feeling rather than flashy techniques. They left with a sense of inspiration that extended beyond music, an understanding that commitment and authenticity can overcome barriers that appearances create. As evening fell, the hall emptied completely, leaving behind the faint echo of the music that had filled it hours earlier. The portraits on the walls, once distant and formal, seemed to witness the unfolding of something meaningful. The man's performance had become part of the hall's history, a story that would be shared quietly among musicians, critics, and students for years. It was a performance that proved greatness often comes from the least expected places, and that talent cannot be measured by superficial standards. He walked home under the setting sun, his steps calm and unhurried. He reflected on the day's events, thinking of the lessons shared without a single word spoken. The applause, the awe, the astonishment. They were all acknowledgments of the truth he had known for years, that persistence, passion, and authenticity matter far more than appearance. People would remember the music, but more importantly, they would remember the lesson it carried. At home, he sat quietly, thinking about the future. The day had been a victory not because of recognition, but because he had reminded others of something essential. He had shown that humility does not equate to weakness, that true ability is revealed through action, not through outward presentation. The music had been his messenger, and it had been heard loud and clear. Even in the weeks that followed, the effects of the performance continued to ripple outward. Letters, messages, and inquiries arrived from people who had been in the hall, as well as those who had heard about the story. Many sought guidance, instruction, or mentorship. The man responded carefully, always emphasizing learning, practice, and emotional honesty. His influence began to extend beyond the hall and the city, touching the lives of people who sought inspiration not just in music but in life itself. Through it all, he remained grounded. Applause, letters, and recognition were appreciated but not craved. The true satisfaction came from knowing that his music had touched hearts, opened minds, and challenged assumptions. Each day, he continued to play, teach, and share, aware that greatness is as much about what one gives to others as what one receives in return. The world had finally begun to see him, not for his worn clothes, but for the extraordinary gift he carried within. Over the years, the man's life took on a rhythm that was quiet yet profound. He did not seek fame or wealth, but he found satisfaction in teaching, performing, and sharing his music with anyone willing to listen. His reputation had grown slowly, not through grand announcements, but through word of mouth and the stories of those whose lives he had touched. People who had once doubted him continued to speak of the performance they had witnessed, the man in humble clothes whose talent could not be ignored. He started teaching young students, many of whom came from humble backgrounds like his own. He was patient with them, showing them that music was more than just notes on a page. It was an expression of the heart, a way to communicate emotions too complex for words. He encouraged them to find their own voice, to play not for applause or recognition, but for the joy and fulfillment that music could bring. His teaching went beyond technique. It was about perseverance, humility, and authenticity. The students admired him not only for his skill but for the quiet strength he carried. He had faced judgments and doubts, yet he had continued without complaint, letting his talent speak for itself. They saw in him an example of resilience, someone who turned obstacles into motivation and never allowed outward appearances to define his worth. Many of them carried his lessons into their own lives, learning that true success is measured by the depth of one's passion and the courage to follow it. Performances continued, often in small, intimate halls, but sometimes in larger venues when invitations arrived. Each time, he played with the same sincerity and focus as the first day he had walked onto the grand stage. The applause and admiration were always welcome, but never the goal. He understood that the value of music lay in its ability to touch hearts and create connections. The audience might leave with smiles, tears, or quiet reflection, but each response was proof that the music had reached them. The story of the man in humble clothes became something of a legend among local musicians and students. They would speak of how appearances could deceive, how talent could be hidden behind a worn coat or scuffed shoes. The lesson was clear: never underestimate someone based on outward looks alone. His life and work became a quiet reminder that dedication, passion, and authenticity were more important than any superficial measure. Over time, he began to write about his experiences, compiling notes and reflections on music, teaching, and life. These writings were modest, never intended for publication, but they captured wisdom that was practical and heartfelt. He wrote about the importance of listening deeply, of observing the world and translating its emotions into sound. He emphasized patience, practice, and the courage to take risks, showing students and readers alike that mastery is a journey, not a destination. Even as recognition grew, he remained grounded. He refused invitations that felt more like spectacles than meaningful opportunities to share music. He preferred spaces where the connection between musician and listener could be genuine, where the focus was on the sound and the emotion it carried, rather than on appearances or status. This approach inspired many, demonstrating that a true artist values the craft above all else. His influence began to extend beyond music alone. People who had experienced his performances spoke of the way he had changed their perspective on judgment and expectation. Business people, students, and everyday citizens carried the story of the humble man whose talent defied appearances. They began to question their own assumptions, becoming more open to seeing the potential and value in others without prejudice. His life became an example of how quiet actions and integrity could inspire change in the world around him. He continued to perform in various settings, sometimes with groups, sometimes alone, but always with the same commitment to emotional honesty. Each performance was unique, reflecting the moment, the space, and the audience. He never relied on repetition or formula. He trusted his instincts, his experience, and his understanding of the instrument. People noticed that each note carried meaning, that each pause, each chord, each melody was intentional and heartfelt. They felt as if the music had been created just for them, and that intimacy made every performance unforgettable. Years passed, and his students grew into musicians themselves, carrying forward the lessons they had learned. Some performed in public spaces, others became teachers, and a few even achieved recognition in larger venues. Wherever they went, they spoke of the quiet man who had taught them that greatness is measured not by wealth, appearance, or applause, but by the depth of one's dedication and the sincerity of one's expression. His influence became a ripple, extending far beyond his immediate reach. He remained humble, continuing to walk through life with the same quiet dignity that had always defined him. People admired him for his skill, yes, but also for his character. He never let praise inflate his ego, and he never let judgment or skepticism diminish his confidence. His life was a testament to the power of perseverance, passion, and authenticity, showing that true genius often thrives in unexpected places. In his later years, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From the early days of practicing in quiet rooms, to the first moment he had walked onto the grand stage, to the many students he had taught and audiences he had touched, every step had been part of a larger story. He understood that the music, the teaching, and the connections he had made were the real measure of success. Applause faded, letters arrived and passed, but the impact on hearts and minds remained permanent. Even as time went on, people remembered him, not for his clothes, his appearance, or the simplicity of his life, but for the extraordinary talent and heart he had shared. Concert halls, classrooms, and quiet spaces alike were filled with echoes of his music, and through it, the story of humility, perseverance, and authenticity continued to inspire. He had proven that appearances could never define a person, and that the truest measure of greatness lay in dedication, passion, and the courage to share one's gifts. At the end of each day, he would sit quietly, reflecting on the music that had shaped his life and the lives of those around him. He felt content, knowing that he had lived authentically, had shared his talent, and had inspired others to do the same. The world had finally seen him for who he truly was, not through the lens of his worn clothes, but through the power of his music, his humility, and his unwavering dedication. In the end, that was all that mattered, and it was more than enough.